sensitized us. Unlike the Sahaba before them, Western Muslims were not displaying sufficient love and devotion for Muhammad, and this had to change. The prognosis, his solution, let's go back to the time of the Prophet, as most any Salafi would tell you to do, and see how things were then. This is the way we should follow, the way of the Sahaba. We're telling the story from Sahih Bukhari Hadith, from one of the Sahih Bukhari Hadiths rather, about Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, a poet and Jewish tribal leader in pre-Islamic Mecca, who wrote poems insulting the Prophet and lamenting the victory of Muslims over the Quraysh in the Battle of Badr. Al-Laki informed listeners that Muhammad sanctioned this man's murder. Muhammad ibn Maslama, a follower and man tasked with al-Ashraf's assassination, was praised by Al-Laki for his zeal and devotion. But what of modern-day Western Muslims? He asks, how concerned are you? How concerned are we when it comes to the honor of Rasul? When it comes to the honor of Islam? When it comes to the Book of Allah? How serious do we take it? We want the spirit of the Sahaba. It's very difficult to read this message as anything else than an enjoiner to kill anyone deemed to have insulted or ridiculed the Prophet. And I was going to give a couple of case studies, but I think I've probably gone over my time, so maybe I'll discuss those later. Thank you.
Fantastic, Alexander. Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. You can see now why I was excited about this and the richness that I had forecasted. I think is we've seen a good bit of that. Let's do this. Let's open it up for questions. I'm going to take the prerogative of having these bright minds next to me and ask 2 or 3 here and ask particular panelists to address them. But then we'll open it up. We have microphones, as you know, and when the microphones come around, we ask you to identify yourself and to state a question. And that's it. Let me ask this. We talked a bit about political situations, local adaptations. We didn't talk much about the political dislocations, openings, and even disillusionment that may be coming out of the Arab Spring, or that may be manifesting in other ways. Brian, I wanted to ask you in particular how you see those political dislocations and openings impacting the movement, how we should be thinking about research in this field. And in particular, I'm interested in the question of whether or not Al-Qaeda, either in its local forms, its ideology, its political narrative, can actually adapt to these political openings in ways that we haven't to date seen or been able to forecast. Are we able, for example, to see a radical Salafi political movement emerge out of North Africa that in some ways gives new political wind to the sails of Al-Qaeda's agenda? So that's the question I'd like you to address. Dr. Saipov, related to that, to what extent does the attempts to harness, to harmonize sanctioned Islam in Central Asia, which is something you see not just in Uzbekistan but in the region, to what extent does that political dynamic further radicalize groups and further consolidate the various groups that you mentioned, in essence putting the groups like Jamiat al-Tabligh, Hizbat al-Tahrir, and the others into the same basket, and in essence forming the non-sanctioned form of Islam that may ultimately turn violent. And then Alexander, if I could ask you in terms of this question of how these political dislocations in the Arab world are actually impacting in terms of messaging to the West. I think that's an element that we haven't seen much discussed or researched, which is a lot of discussion and talk about how the Arab Spring is impacting in the region, but how are the implications of that affecting how Al-Qaeda is thinking about its image, its propaganda, its narrative toward Westerners and toward Western audiences? And then Tom, I'd like to ask you, given the import of Osama bin Laden, and as we've talked about the importance of leadership, how should we think about leadership of this movement moving forward? We've seen Bayat pledged to Zawahiri by a couple of the franchises. We've seen fealty to Mullah Omar from Zawahiri repeated over and over. How should we be thinking about leadership and the role of influencers as we look at this movement, in particular post bin Laden? And then Anne, finally to you. I'm sorry to pile on here. You're obviously looking at the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. To what extent do these relationships play off of each other? Because obviously these are not bilateral or isolated binary relationships. You have other groups at play, the Haqqani network, the Pakistan Taliban, others that have interests in how the relationship with Al-Qaeda and relationship with the Afghan Taliban evolves. So how should we think about that, and should that be part of a research project? So with that, Brian, if you could answer my first question.
Yeah, thank you. It's a hard question. It's obviously a big question. Maybe right now it's the key question for those of us that are studying this issue. You know, I guess I would take some lessons from some of the things that Ann was saying, that local factors are really going to drive a lot of the dynamics in each place. And by local factors, I don't just mean within the boundaries of Libya. I mean within particular sort of regional settings and where authentic communities exist, especially in a place like North Africa, where borders are porous and there are, you know, ethnic and economic communities that cross those borders. We should really look in a regional sense to try to understand these questions, and people that understand those regions and study them directly, I think, are probably best positioned to answer this question, rather than someone like me that studies Al-Qaeda at large. That said, I think that the Arab Spring was a serious setback at an ideological level for Al-Qaeda. I mentioned before that they've sort of done this pirouette to try to turn and redirect away from the notion that violence is imperative in overthrowing these governments. But as Tom noted, that's a tough one for them to do. I mean, they've been saying that for a long, long time. The way that it's interesting, I looked at this recent, and they've been doing this, you know, for the last 5 or 6 months now, I guess. But in this recent statement from yesterday that was released, Zawahiri makes an interesting argument where he says, look, you know, our focus wasn't on using violence to overthrow the local governments, right? That's what we changed in the 1990s. Remember when we said we were going to focus on the violence on the far enemy, and that meant that these local governments would therefore collapse. And so really all of this is consistent with what we've been trying to do the entire time. You know, you can build a framework. I understand what he's doing. And one of the things that these guys do really well, I think, is build intellectual frameworks to justify and explain that they had a grand strategic plan all along that was really just accidental things happening, right? A lot of the time, I think we make the mistake of reading real strategy into what is essentially, you know, a ex post facto sort of justification of what's been happening. The real issue, I think, in all of these places is going to be whether these revolutions produce better societies for their people. If they don't, Al-Qaeda's got legs in all of these places, and that's the bottom line. Where do I worry about in particular? I think I certainly worry about the Sinai right now. I worry about the Sinai more so than I do sort of the potential for urban violence in Egypt. I think we look at the sort of notion of a political Salafi movement in Egypt in particular. There are folks, Wilma Kantz is one, who's starting to make the argument that participation in sort of democratic forms is not necessarily opposed to jihadi thought process, so long as these are not lawmaking institutions. I think that's kind of a fuzzy line, but I think that we probably will see some Salafi influence in a political process in Egypt. I don't think that means it's Al-Qaeda, and I don't think we need to, while I think the ideological element is really important here, look, there's lots and lots of Salafis that don't buy into Al-Qaeda's ideas, and pointed to some of the folks that were extremely takfiri in the sense that didn't want to play with the Taliban in the 1990s, fundamentally more religiously and more socially extreme than even Al-Qaeda, are nonviolent movements even today. And there's a number of Kuwaiti groups that fall into that category. I worry about that there is possibility of some bleed out. There are jihadi networks that exist in Libya that I think are hinted at in a study that we did at West Point on the Sinjar records. But the place that I really worry about Al-Qaeda mobilization in the near term is Syria. And I don't think a lot of folks are saying that, but that's where I worry. I think part of this is historically I've studied Iraq, and I know quite a bit about AQI, and I think that's a movement that we've sort of forgotten about, but that is still real. They have networks in Syria, and I think that this is a place that allows jihadis to tell the story that they love to tell. They can tell a sectarian story. They can tell an oppression story. They can tell the Syrians have been protecting the Israelis forever story. And that's the argument they make. And so it's also a place where violence has been part of this revolution. And one thing we know from social science is that where there has been violence, there is likely to be violence in the future, right? I know that sounds like a basic thing, but that's sort of an interesting dynamic. And so I see Syria as a place where I would look to this even more so than Egypt, with the exception of the Sinai and efforts to provoke the Israelis.
Thank you. Dr. Saipov, just briefly, if you could, on the question of whether or not the attempts to use political constraints on religious expression exacerbate the problem or creates a potential problem.
Thank you very much for your question. I can say that despite government, of course, government is trying to harness this, you said, harmonize and further combat against the terrorism and extremism, but actually it's this counterterrorism measure of the government goes hand in hand with both trying counteract the religious extremism, and both it goes in hand with the centralization of its state authority and the power to extend the power and its regulations to all its peripheries. And most important thing about this alphabet soup of kind of abbreviations and IMUs and other Islamic religious movements and networks, what we can say. Yes, it does exacerbate, but if you look at them, right, you look at the way how they pray namaz, right, prayers, salah. So it's, or how they grow their beards. You can see it's not the traditional Islam that our forefathers, right, followed the path, right? It's outer kind of the way of model of ritual behavior that is brought from the Middle Eastern, from the Middle East. Despite the government discouragement of publicly showcasing the religiosity, piety is not diminishing, because from the cities and towns, as I said, I also visit the different private houses, right, and in different parts of the city and the regions. And my insight was that I entered, for example, one house, and I paid attention to the Madonna plate sets, right? It's very famous in many places, and Uzbekistan is not an exclusion. The Madonna sets are just on the table, but it's retouched and it's shaped the famous Madonna pictures, right? And in building private houses in suburban areas with no outer windows outside the respective constructions. And people who own and practice this kind of Islam, they also have some business commercial sites. And for example, in sports magazines, they're not selling chessmen, right? They're saying that it's kind of, it's against their vision, their version of Islam. For example, there was also, for example, authorities obliged the cafes and restaurants, especially owned by observing Muslims, not to sell alcohol. But it's not consuming alcohol. It's to all that in Islam, you know that you can't say that people do not identify which kind of movement they belong to. Therefore, it's very difficult to distinguish. But after some afterthoughts, in these cafes and restaurants, Muslims managed to find a way out. They began selling alcohol by putting tenfold price tags on them. So consequently discouraging every potential customer not to purchase particular items from the venues of public catering. So it might serve in both ways, both exacerbate. But I can compare these movements to a mercury. Mercury, you do not use. I have not seen this thermometer, for example, in the United States, but in our parts of the world, to find out the temperature of the body, we use the thermometer, and in the thermometer you can see the mercury, the small grams of mercury. And if you break the mercury, it will be dispersed from different parts, so on the surface. But if you just play with the mercury, right, they will find a way and will conglomerate. And the garment is just dispersed, the mercury. They are broken into different pieces, and they are lying in different